Thank you. I am smiling because I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm nervous. And I'm also smiling because I am passionate about the subject of my research that I'm going to share with you today. Now, the subject of my research is the lack of women in corporate leadership. Why am I enthusiastic about that? I'll tell you why. When I was in college, I majored in economics. I actually liked math and economics. And you know what people said to me when I mentioned my major? This was almost 20 years ago now. They said, brilliant. That's very smart because very few women go into math and economics. You are a hot commodity. And what I learned in economics further affirmed that belief. A scarce resource is very valuable. The more rare something is, the more you pay for that resource. So my naive 20-something-year-old self entered the workforce feeling like a hot commodity. And frankly, that was some time ago now, and over the years, I still feel the same. Women are a hot commodity. And that is what motivates me in my research today. So I work at the UC Davis Graduate School of Management, and I get to author the school's annual study of women business leaders in California. This is a census of the women top executives and directors on the boards at the largest 400 public companies in California by market capitalization. So we believe that our role is to track the numbers. And the numbers don't necessarily tell the whole story. We all know they can indicate a larger issue underneath. We believe our role at UC Davis is to track those numbers every year very carefully so that companies are armed with that information to then tackle diversity in their own way. So what did we find in our study? These are the top 10 companies in California according to leadership gender diversity, which is on the right-hand column there. And they exhibit a very high level of leadership gender diversity. And notice that the top two firms on this list are very recognizable food-related Bay Area companies. Annie's Organics of Berkeley and Williams-Sonoma of San Francisco. The former has a male CEO, the latter has a female CEO. They both have a perfectly gender diverse leadership team. And in fact, Bay Area companies are overrepresented on this list. All but 3 are Bay Area companies. So that speaks very well of everyone in this room and the companies represented here today. Now notice at the bottom of this list that the top 10 companies by leadership gender diversity exhibit some traits that are different from the average company in our study. They're much more likely to have a female CEO. They have revenue that is twice as high and net profit that is 4 times as high as the average company in our study. So what was our main finding? That women hold 11.5% of these top leadership positions. That's the top 5 highest compensated executives in each company and the members of the board of directors. Now, we get our data from the Securities and Exchange Commission for several reasons. It is publicly available data because the public companies are required to submit reports to the SEC every year. So we know the data will be there and accessible to us. The instructions are written in such a way that the data is very clearly comparable. We can compare apples to apples when we're looking across companies. And the third reason is because these companies are required to submit the data, we avoid a bias that comes from companies being allowed to decide whether to disclose their data, which they're more likely to do if it's good, or simply not disclose their information, which they're more likely to do if it's not good information. And this main result mimics the results of a number of studies across the country. And what's perhaps most striking is the trend over time, or lack thereof. And this was alluded to. We've actually been doing our study for 10 years now. And across that time, you can see that women hold approximately 10% of top leadership positions. It's been hovering around 10% for the last 10 years. So the dark blue line here is the women as a percentage of directors on the board. And just below that, the yellow line is the percentage of women among top 5 highest compensated executives. That's our measure of executives. The top line is a different measure of executives. Companies can actually name their executive team, and that can be more than 5 people. So it's a slightly different measure. It's not as comparable across companies, but we show it on this chart to disclose that the 2 measures of executives have a similar trend over time. And then the bottom red line is the women as a percentage of CEOs. We had only 14 female CEOs out of the 400 companies. And this actually mirrors what we see in the Fortune 500 and the S&P 500, about 4% female CEOs, more or less. Now, going back to directors and executives, notice that these 2 lines went in opposite directions this last year. We actually have fewer women top executives this year in California than we did a year before. But directors are increasing over time, and I'm going to zoom in on that. So this is the percentage of women directors in our study of 400 companies over the last 9 years. And you can see that the last 3 years have seen a somewhat dramatic increase, and it's actually been growing every year. And at the current year's rate, women are tracking 20% of California board positions by the year 2020. Now, this isn't the whole story, because even on boards, there are still further leadership positions. This is the first year we looked at subcommittee board chair positions. And we looked at nominating, compensation, and audit. And women hold that subcommittee chair position about 10 to 14% of the time, which is equal to their representation on the boards, more or less. However, there was a big discrepancy when we looked at the most powerful position on boards, the board chair position. Women were noticeably lacking. Only 9 women in our study of 400 companies hold that position, fewer than there were women CEOs. So I thought that was an interesting result. And now I'm going to turn to executives. So again, we're looking at the top 5 highest compensated executives, because that is who companies are required to report executive compensation data for. So among these highest compensated executives, I sorted them into job roles by their title. And it was pretty clear. CEO, executive director, president, division president, CEO, chief operating officer, executive or corporate vice president, and so on. And the last category there is an other category, which is mostly chief something officer. And what I did is I sorted these according to their descending total compensation in that role among men and women in the role. And what clearly emerges is the women executives, and this is similar to the point that I was making on the last slide about directors. Women executives are least present in the most powerful roles. So if you look at general counsel, which is third from the right, this is where women are most present. 1 out of 5 of these top compensated executives who were general counsels were women. 20%, and the total compensation in that role is $1.3 million, but this is actually one of the lowest compensation levels among these top executives. So this was actually the first year that we looked at executive compensation data in our study. This was new for us, and we were very pleased to be able to look at it. So the overall breakdown between men and women looks like this. On the left, I've got CEOs, men versus women, and on the right is these top compensated executives, men versus women. Now, total compensation includes salary, stocks, options, bonus and incentive pay, which is based on company performance, and other, which is retirement and deferred earnings. And on the left here, you see that for CEOs, this was one of the things that I thought was most interesting about the study this year. The women CEOs in California earned more than the men CEOs. And this is actually the median rather than the average, so it's not driven by outliers. so I thought this was very interesting, and the reason why the female CEOs made more was entirely due to their incentive pay. So they just happened to be at companies that performed much better on average, and their incentive pay reflected that. Now that I've said that, we actually can't read too much into that because there were only 14 female CEOs. So it was a very small sample size, but I think this is so interesting that I'm currently in the process of obtaining a larger data set, because I wonder if this particular result might actually hold in a different setting. I think it's very interesting. So on the right, we see what we might have more often expected in this case. This is among all of these top executives, including CEOs. Overall, the women earned compensation that was 74% of the total compensation of the men. Now, the lack of diversity that I'm talking about here today actually goes beyond gender. So we actually looked at the ethnic diversity among directors on boards at companies in our study that were also in the Fortune 1000. There were 91 of them. So white men are almost 3/4 of the board positions in California. And then we also have white women, 15%, minority men, 10%, and then this tiny little white sliver here is minority women, 1.6% of board positions. Now, what's interesting here is when you compare this to the distribution of California. California's population is particularly diverse. So white men who hold almost 3/4 of the corporate director positions are actually only 20% of the population in California. And on the other hand, minority women who are least well represented are actually 30% of the population. So that was a really stark contrast there. So there are many challenges when addressing diversity. And one of them is differing viewpoints. This was a study that was conducted by some professors at Harvard Business School where they interviewed male and female corporate directors in the US and a few in Europe. And they found that 87% of the female corporate directors said they faced gender-related hurdles. And at the same time, 56% of the male corporate directors said women do not face gender-related hurdles. So not saying that either perspective is right or wrong, this is a very different viewpoint that we're coming from. So just one of the many challenges that companies face when addressing this issue. And the state of California has clearly charged companies with addressing this issue. In September of 2013, the state government passed Resolution SCR 62, which does not mandate anything as a resolution. It simply encourages companies to promote equitable and diverse gender representation on corporate boards. Now, it does suggest this benchmark of 3 women on boards with 9 or more directors, and 2 women on boards with 6, 7, or 8 directors. And the question is, how do companies respond to this? And what I've found is that there is an uptick in the response, which I take to be very encouraging. So on the left here, I've looked at all 400 companies in our study this year, and I compared them to where those same 400 companies were a year ago. And on the right, I took the top 25 companies in our study and compared them to where those same 25 companies were a year ago. And the uptick on the right is a little higher, which would be expected because those are companies that have more women in leadership to begin with. So they are more closely within striking distance, if you will. But in both cases, there's clearly an uptick. So on the left, the average company moved from 13% to 16% agreement with the standards of this resolution, meaning that that percentage of companies actually met that, the 3 women, the suggestion of 3 women for boards with 9 or more. And I realized I left out a key point here, which was that when the resolution was passed, we actually had 138 of these 400 companies with no women on the board. So you can imagine not very many companies were meeting the standards to begin with. It was a very audacious goal that was set by the resolution. And this might not seem like much of an uptick, but let me point out that it's actually a very early response, because our 2014-15 study, which was just released last month, December 2014, is based on proxy reports from the 2014 proxy season, in which companies are most often reporting on a fiscal year that ended December 31st of 2013. Well, that was just 3 months after the resolution passed. So this is the reaction that happened within 3 months. So I think that's a very encouraging sign. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that at UC Davis, we are very committed to continuing to do this study every year, and we hope everyone will join us in continuing to raise awareness and promote best practices that we're going to hear about today, and encourage companies to improve these results in the future. Thank you.